Hey guys, it's Ashley, and today we're going to be talking about Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy by Cassandra Clare, Sarah Reese Brennan, Maureen Johnson, and Robin Wasserman. Normally I do just say Cassandra Clare and friends, but I figured since it was a book talk, I might as well include everybody who contributed to this wonderful book. All of these wonderful people who made this amazing book, and I cannot wait to talk about it today with you guys. A majority of this book talk is going to be massive spoilers for the Mortal Instruments series. If you haven't read that yet, I highly suggest not watching this video unless you are never gonna read it and you just want to know what's gonna happen afterwards anyways, then by all means go for it. I would stop here if you're not very much into the Mortal Instruments yet, but if you have read it, then by all means continue on however you might please. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy occurs after City of Heavenly Fire, so I believe it's before Lady Midnight, but after City of Heavenly Fire. We follow Simon, okay, who has lost all of his memories and is just starting to get them back as he goes to the Shadowhunter Academy to ascend to become a Shadowhunter. So since at this point everybody who's watching, or everybody who doesn't care about being spoiled, already knows that Simon has lost his memories, one of the best parts that I thought came from this story was Simon's development through each individual story and through the timeline of the book. Simon throughout this story comes to terms with the fact that the person that he was before, the person that had all of these old memories and all of these great times with his friends, is not the person that he is throughout this entirety of this book. He's going to be having all of these new experiences to help him get through his life. He's going to be having to deal with the fact that during this time he gained all of these new things and information and knowledge that can help him later in life, and he's never going to be the same person that he was. He's never going to be the same exact person that Isabel fell in love with. He's never going to be the same exact person that Clary was best friends with, but he's just as great, if not better, than who he was before. And I loved that development aspect of Simon in this book, okay? Another one of the things that I absolutely loved was that each individual story, well, not each one, but a majority of them, contain characters or flashbacks or anything that we're familiar with. There were appearances by Jace and Izzy and Clary and Alec and Magnus, who we love, but then there were also appearances from Tessa. There was flashbacks with Will and Tessa and Jem and their children. There was a James Herondale story and a Helen Blackthorne story. And then there was one with Emma and Julian. Like, I loved how it was all combined into this story, and despite the fact that Simon is having to deal with all of these hardships and coming to terms with his memory loss, that he gets to experience this with people that he's familiar with, or at least partially familiar with, so I really enjoyed that. I thought that a lot of the new characters that were introduced, especially George, really hit my heart. I loved him so much, but a lot of the other ones I didn't really care for, I guess, except for, I think her name was Marisol. Marisol was so funny. Oh my god, but I mean, we'll get to that later in the spoilery section. All in all, I really loved this book. I highly suggest reading it. Definitely before Lady Midnight, because I read Lady Midnight first and I regret that. Not really for any specific reason. It does spoil you just a teeny bit for like one of the stories or a couple of the stories, I guess, but not anything that I was like really pissed off at myself because I had read it. So that is all I'm going to say for the non-spoilery section. I have a shit ton to get to in the spoilery section. This video is probably going to be 20 minutes long. I'm gonna go through each individual story one by one, so even if you haven't read all the stories, you can watch the ones that you have read. And this, my friends, is where we part if you have not yet read this story or any of the stories within the stories. So all of you people who haven't read it yet, please leave, come back when you have, and we can talk about it together, okay? So bye! So the first story is Welcome to the Shadowhunter Academy. Now I love this title. It just completely opens up the book to this whole new world that we're being introduced to. It's not even a world, it's just a building, it's just a school. What am I talking about? But I loved it anyways. So, like I said before, knowing that Simon was struggling with his memory loss was just absolutely heartbreaking. I am heartbroken because Simon was one of my favorite characters in the Mortal Instruments. Honestly, he was. And I love my baby so much, and I don't want anything to happen to him. And it was just so sad, and I couldn't deal. Going along with the heartbreaking scenes in this story was when he was remembering losing Jordan in City of Heavenly Fire, when he was remembering that moment where Jordan died. Like, Oh my god. As if he wasn't already devastated enough that he wasn't going to be the hero that he was, that everybody knows him for. Now he has to remember the death of one of his best friends. Like, really? We're just all being thrown this in the first story? Thanks so much, Cassie. Like I said before, George instantly became one of my favorite characters. I absolutely loved how he found out that his name was George Lovelace, right? But he wasn't really a Lovelace, he was just pretending to be. I loved that the actual Shadowhunter family, the Lovelaces, in Scotland adopted him and gave him this name and then shipped him off to the Shadowhunter Academy when it was time. I love that the Lovelaces want nothing to do with anybody, that they're quitters, right? I think that's what he said. They're quitters and they don't do anything, and George wanted to do something, and I just loved that so much. I absolutely loved the moment when Simon stood up to John when he was bashing Downworlders. I loved it, I loved it, I loved it. And last, my favorite part of this entire story was that Isabel moment at the very end, when Isabel comes in and she basically just kicks down the door and she's like, "This is my boyfriend, bitches. Stay out of the way." I loved that part. That was so Isabel. Oh my goodness. You go, Isabel, you go. You fight for your man. So the second story is the Lost Herondale. This is the story where Katerina tells Simon about how she stole Tobias Herondale's baby, because Tobias Herondale was going on this hunt for this demon, and then the demon found him and it like made him lose his mind, and Tobias abandoned his fellow Shadowhunters, and it's like the #1 rule that you never do ever. You never abandon your fellow Shadowhunters in battle or you will get stripped of your marks. They didn't know that he had been brainwashed, I guess, and so he ran off and he never returned, and so instead of trying to find him to deliver the punishment to him, they just decided they would deliver the punishment to his wife and his unborn child. I remember hearing about this story. I remember it. But it's just awful. Every single time it comes back and it hits you in the face and you're like, how the hell could these people do that? Katerina stole the baby and took him off and raised him and shipped him off to apparently America, I guess. But thank God for Katerina. I hated the part where Simon was starting to break Isabel's heart. He feels like he can't live up to her expectations, and so he has to go ahead and just break up with her. Like, Simon, no, just tell her how you feel. Don't. Simon. So they go on this hunt to kill this vampire, and she seems to recognize Simon, and I couldn't remember if this was a vampire we had met in the Mortal Instruments or not. My first thought was that it was Maureen, and then I thought, wait, did Maureen die? And then my third thought was, holy shit, I need to reread these books because I can't even remember if Maureen died or not. And Clary's appearance in this story made the story that much better, because I love Clary and I love the moment where Simon remembers that he loves her just as fiercely as he loves himself, and my heart just swelled above and beyond what he did to break it when he broke Isabel's heart, and it made up for it. Not really, but sort of. The third story is the Whitechapel Field. Now this one at this point had been one of my favorites so far. I absolutely loved this one so much, and I don't know if it was just because there were so many character appearances or because of the flashback or what it was, but it had been one of my favorites, and it probably still ranks high up there. So in the beginning of the story, we immediately get Jace. Jace is teaching the Shadowhunter Academy students how to properly fall off a tree like a Shadowhunter. If that is not a Jace thing to teach somebody, I don't know what is. And then Tessa comes in and we get a flashback to her family with Tessa and Will and Cecily, and I think it was Gabriel and not Jem. I can't remember whether it was Gabriel or Jem. I'm pretty sure it was Gabriel. Even though it was like kind of scary because their children disappeared for a minute and we were sure that the demon had gotten them, I still loved it because we got to see them all back together again. And then right afterwards, Jace finally speaks to Tessa, because Tessa is one of his only living relatives other than this Lost Herondale, who I will not give the name of now. So he finally gets up the courage to talk to her, and it's just so sweet, and I loved it so much, and I loved it even more that Simon was the one who guided him to go talk to her again. I loved it. I loved it so much. And then at the end, Simon writes the letter to Izzy, and it's just so endearing and heartfelt. We end with Jace and that line about how Simon used to love being called Wiggles. And it's just such a Jace thing. And I loved it so much. So the next story is called Nothing But Shadows, and this one actually outranked the Whitechapel Field to me. This story went above and beyond the one before it, because we got James Herondale. I knew nothing about James Herondale going into this. I honestly was so confused before this with the Last Hours characters and how that's going to play out and who was the daughter and son of who, and I really didn't make an effort to find out when I could have, but I love James Herondale. When Will is riding on the carriage with James and he says that he stole the carriage from Gabriel. Throughout this story, I felt for James so much because just like him, I was that person who in high school, if I didn't know anybody in the class, I would walk in and I would pray for there to be a seating chart because I would have absolutely no idea where to sit. If I didn't know anybody, I was not the person who would be able to just go up and make friends. I was the person who would walk around and kind of like stand there, stock still, and be like, I don't know what I'm doing. Goatface Herondale. That was cruel. James has these like golden eyes, and they're the same eyes that Jace has, I believe, right? And it's just so weird how in our time, in the future, in the present, that people can just swoon over Jace and his eyes. But in this time, nobody likes them, and they think he's a freak, and they call him Goatface Herondale. It's awful, and it's cruel, and I hated it. So, his and Matthew's relationship, like, really changed throughout this entire story. In the beginning, I absolutely hated Matthew with such just a dying hatred. I hated him so much. And toward the end, he like really grew on me. And when James can find out that he can turn into a shadow, like, what the hell, man? Like, it makes sense because Tessa is a warlock. Tessa is part demon. She has something in her that may have passed down to her children. And when they were about to throw him out because he was different, it just reminded me back to the present where we are exiling Mark and Helen because they have fairy blood. Just because you dislike a part of them does not mean that you get to completely discriminate and just push them away, okay? They are Shadowhunters. They belong just as much as you do. I started crying, you guys, when Jem was talking to James and he was telling him that he's not darkness and he's not shadow. He's bright and light and he brings hope to everybody, and I legit started crying. No joke. Like, my love for James Herondale after this story is real. So the next story is called The Evil We Love, and this one particularly revolves around Robert Lightwood. Now, because Robert's back, Izzy comes back, obviously, and her role in this story I loved so much. I loved how she manipulated everybody into thinking that they were, you know, gonna summon a demon, but in reality it was just to prove out who was more strong than the others. Loved it so much, especially that she believed in Simon, and she knew that he wouldn't go along with it because he knew it was wrong. So we get another flashback, and this one is particularly revolved around Robert Lightwood and Valentine and the Circle, especially Robert and Michael Wayland. I knew right off the bat that Michael Wayland was in love with Robert. Like, I didn't think that there was any other way to put it. I knew immediately. At some point in the story, Michael Wayland was going to tell Robert that he was in love with him, and Robert was going to completely hate him and push him away, because we all know what Robert did to Alec when Alec came out. And Alec's his own son, so what's he gonna do to his best friend? Ugh, my god, Robert, I just don't really like you right now. But something that I did like about the story, though, was that we got to see Valentine younger, like a younger version of Valentine, and I loved how he started mentioning his father and that he wanted revenge for his father, and we just got to see more into Valentine. So I don't know, I liked it, but I hated it at the same time. So the next story is Pale Kings and Princes, and this one revolves around Helen Blackthorne. Now, Helen Blackthorne is one of those characters that is just, she has such inner strength and such confidence that I admire so much in her. Now, the reason that Helen is back is, I think, because they told her that if she comes back and teaches the Shadowhunter students that fairies are bad and that you can never trust a fairy, I guess, that she and Aline can come back for a day and get married in Idris as Shadowhunters. And that is enough for Helen to just say, fine, I'll do it. For Aline. And it's another reason why I love her so much. And then when Izzy pops out from behind Helen before she can even give him the letter, like, oh my god, I love Izzy so much. Now, Izzy takes Simon on Jace's advice, okay, to a weapons shop to pick out his first weapon. I had a couple problems with this. One, why would you take Jace's advice on anything? And two, Simon in a weapons shop, this is not going to end well at all. But then Simon has to be adorable and he takes her to the banks of Lake Lynn. They finally get to the bottom of their problems and then they start making out and I was like, thank God, finally. Finally! It's literally been leading up to this point throughout the entire book so far. So I just, A+. Good job, Simon. Good job. So the next story is called Bitter of Tongue. Now, we open up with an amazing scene. Marisol, who I mentioned at the beginning, is torturing John, basically. She's so tiny and she's a mundane, but she acts like such a Shadowhunter, and it's so funny. She's torturing John by explaining things that happen in the mundane world. John is like, you want to split up but stay together? Do you understand what all those words mean? And then Marisol goes, do you know what World of Warcraft means? And then John goes, yes, I do. All put together in that way, no, I do not, and I do not wish to. God, I love Marisol and John so much at this point. When Simon was thrust into the fairy world, I had an absolute heart attack. But then, of course, Mark Blackthorne shows up, and I was kind of hoping and expecting for this. It definitely made a difference me reading this after I read Lady Midnight. It is still so devastating when he finds out that the Shadowhunters are not even looking for him. They're not coming for him to try to save him and help him and take him out of this horrible place. And every night, to make sure that he remembers who he is and he doesn't get lost into the wildness of fairy, he repeats his sisters and brothers' names to the stars. And the story makes me want to cry. Izzy shows up and she busts him out of that cage and all is well and done. And then they get locked back in the cage. And all is not well and done. But then Izzy has the key and they get out of the cage and all is well and done again. And then Simon goes to Helen and Aline's wedding and it's adorable and it's everything that I wanted out of their wedding. And he sees Jules there. And again, because I've already read Lady Midnight, there was definitely a difference in the way that I read this. But still, the fact that he was only 14 in this story and he was still having to act like the father figure, it still just killed me. It killed me and it makes my heart break, and just these Blackthorns, man, I admire their strength so much. So the next story is called The Fiery Trial, and this one is about basically the parabatai test trial bond thing that goes on when you become parabatai. I can't remember what it's called, but that thing. So the premise is that Emma and Julian are becoming parabatai and they want Clary and Simon to be their seconds in it, I guess. And then we get this whole really weird scene where Jem and Magnus and Katerina essentially drug Simon and Clary with Lake Lynn water, and they go through this hallucination, and then in the end they find out that they are meant to be parabatai. Like, it was the weirdest thing that I had ever read about ever. Simon was in a boat in a love tunnel with Jace, and Maureen showed up, and Clary was drowning, and it just didn't make any sense whatsoever, and I was so freaking confused. But by the end, when Simon and Clary realized that they were meant to be parabatai, like, everything, it was just all made better. I also loved how uplifting the story was throughout a majority of it. Now, granted, toward the end when we're at Emma and Julian's trial and the parabatai bond is like, they're getting the parabatai rune put on them, I hated it because we know, even without reading Lady Midnight, that Emma and Julian become parabatai and then fall in love with each other, and it's forbidden. So, I mean, even if you haven't read Lady Midnight, this isn't really a spoiler, but I just was screaming every time that they mentioned that Jules looked uncomfortable because I'm like, he's in love with Emma! I loved it, but I hated it at the same time. So the second to last story is called Born to Endless Night, and this one, holy crap, was one of my favorites. This is the story of how Alec and Magnus get their baby warlock and they name him Max, and it's so adorable, and I just loved it so much. One of the moments that I especially loved in this story was that we were in Magnus's point of view. A majority of the time we were in Magnus's point of view, and so I was really excited to be back in his head. Another thing that I loved about this story was Robert. Now, I hated him in the last story that he was in, but in this one, holy crap, he's so adorable. He is obsessed with the baby because it's Alec's son, essentially. And so I love the part where Simon gives him his watch and teaches him how to use it so that in exactly 16 minutes, he'll get the child and he'll get to hold him. Especially the moment where Robert goes up to Magnus and asks him if he made the baby somehow. And Magnus is like, what are you talking about? What? And Robert's like, well, you know, the baby's blue. And, you know, Alec's eyes are blue. And, you know, when you do the magic, that's blue. So I was just wondering. And I died. I died at that part. This is also the story where Simon tells Izzy that he loves her. Oh my god. I love how oh god. And the final story of this book is called Angels Twice Ascending. And this story was so happy and so uplifting, and then so not at all. From the moment this story began, I knew that something was going to happen to George. I knew that he wasn't going to be able to pass the test because he was just being so wistful and so nostalgic about everything, and they were putting a big emphasis on it. And I just knew that something was going to happen to him, and it didn't help the heartbreak any less. I almost panicked when Simon went to go tell his mom bye. He was supposed to go and break the ties, and he was supposed to say, look mom, I'm leaving, I'm never going to see you again, goodbye. But he didn't, and he knows that there's some kind of a loophole somehow, and he's gonna figure it out, and I just love his determination. That was never a part of Simon anyways. He was never gonna just be able to give up on anything. This is a story where Simon and Isabel finally have sex. They do it. They do the deed. I loved the moment where Simon is asking Isabel, wait, we haven't done it before? And Isabel's like, oh, if we had done it, demon amnesia or not, you would have remembered it. I love how confident and how sassy she is. That is the Isabel I know and I love. And then of course at the end, Clary and Izzy and Simon, they all go to the London Institute to see George's gravestone. And Simon sees Jessamyn's ghost and George's ghost, and he decides that his Shadowhunter name for the time being is going to be Lovelace. And personally, I don't think that Simon Lovelace sounds very great, but I mean, it's really heartwarming anyways, the fact that he would choose that name anyways. So I absolutely loved that, and that is the end. This video, honest to God, has been 60 minutes long, this raw footage, and I'm not looking forward to editing it because it's gonna take me forever. I'm finally glad that I was able to get all of my thoughts out about this book, because this book was just amazing and I loved it so much. If you guys have read Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy, please let me know which story was your favorite. I don't know if I have an absolute favorite story, but there were definitely ties between a lot of them. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you want to follow me on social media, I am adash12 on Instagram, Twitter, and Goodreads, and all of my links are in the description below. I will see you next time. Goodbye!